Marianne Williamson is running for president. Maybe you've read one of her many best-selling books, or maybe you've never heard of her. She's known to millions as a spiritual guide, has been featured on Oprah, and was named by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential baby boomers. But what's really impressive about Marianne is her extensive humanitarian work. During the AIDS crisis in the 80s, when many feared those with the virus, Williamson embraced them. She founded the Centers for Living, a place for those with the virus to connect with others and gain psychological and emotional support. In 1989, she founded Project Angel Food, which cooks and delivers meals free of charge to those who are too sick to shop and cook for themselves. The organization has since gone on to serve millions upon millions of meals. In 2004, she co-founded the Peace Alliance, an advocacy group aimed at supporting peace-building approaches to domestic and international conflicts. And for years, Williamson was involved in efforts to end poverty and hunger as a board of directors member of the organization Results. This doesn't even include the countless numbers of people who say reading Marianne's books or hearing her speak has changed their lives. It could be argued that Marianne has done more for people than any other candidate in the race. And she's serious about this race. Running for president isn't just for show. She's so serious, she's packed up from New York City and moved to Iowa.
You know, if you're running for president, you have to run for president. This isn't something you can kind of sort of do. It's not something that's part-time. So if you're really running for president, really run for president. And that's why I said just move to Des Moines.
One of the biggest criticisms Marianne gets is her lack of political experience. Though she has an impressive background as a humanitarian and advocate, she's never held public office. But her point is, why would you want the very people who broke the system to continue to try and fix it?
The idea that only people whose careers have been entrenched within that system should possibly be considered qualified to drive us out of the ditch that drove us into, I find preposterous.
It's ironic for sure that the very people who have dug us into this are the very people that we say, oh no, they're the only ones who are qualified. Yeah. But you know what does make Marianne qualified? She knows exactly what is broken in our political system, and she's willing to call it out: the money.
We can't just talk about needing health care. We have to talk about the obstruction of health insurance companies and big pharma. We can't just talk about gun safety measures. We have to talk about the obstruction of gun manufacturers. We can't just talk about an endless war machine. We have to talk about the obstruction of defense contractors. We can't just talk about what we need to do to save the planet. We need to talk about the obstruction of fossil fuel companies, because it's all one obstruction.
Don't call Marianne a Democratic Party loyalist. Fiercely independent and disgusted with the money in politics, she ran for Congress as an independent in 2014. You actually ran for Congress in my district.
Yeah, here in LA.
Yeah, for my actual congressional district, the 33rd congressional district, because I live in Venice Beach. So, but it was before.
I won Venice, by the way.
Did you?
I won Venice, and I won Topanga Canyon. I won the cool places.
At that time, you ran as an independent.
Yes, I did.
What has changed? Why did you run as an independent and not as a Democrat?
I ran as an independent for, I'm sure, the reasons that would be obvious to you and to your viewers. The unholy alliance of the Democrats and the Republicans has been very disturbing to me for a long time. However, when you say what's changed, Donald Trump is the answer to that. Mm-hmm. And I see now, it's a very different time. I see the issues of the Democrats and the Republicans like two broken legs, two broken arms, and I see the issue of Donald Trump as something more like a bullet near the heart. Mm. So this is not the time for me. Everybody has to make their own decision, but for me, we need to vote for the Democrat in 2020. That's how I feel.
So let's find out about her policy ideas. Most of the candidates have kind of their pet policy idea, if you will. If you've noticed, everybody seems to have one real core message. What would you say is yours if
you have one? Can I have three?
Yes.
Number one, public financing for federal campaigns.
Money out of politics.
Money out of politics. Department of Children and Youth, U.S. Department of Children and Youth, U.S. Department of Peace Building, and a serious conversation about racial healing, including reparations in this country.
Is your number one issue getting money out of politics?
It has to be. I think when I'm president, people say I should say when I'm president, if I'm president, if you make me president, whatever. One of my first things would be to send to Congress proposed legislation for public funding of federal campaigns. How else are we going to do it? Because we're not going to be overturning Citizens United anytime soon.
Do you think in your traveling around the country that people are really truly aware that money in politics is the problem?
You know, I think some people today particularly are a little too enamored of the majority. The majority didn't wake up one day and say, let's free the slaves. The majority didn't wake up one day and say, let's give women the right to vote. The majority didn't say, let's end segregation. It's always a small group of people, usually considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time, who have an idea that is more aligned with the higher possibilities for humanity.
Are you taking big money?
What do you think, Kim? You think they're just lining up to give it to me? So far, that's so not the problem. No, I don't foresee the problem. Of course, I wouldn't.
So you say that children, that's your number two and your platform. So money in politics, and then number two is kids. Like, tell me more about what is it that you think is going on with children, and what do you want to correct?
Millions of American children live in chronic trauma. Millions of American children go to school every day. Some schools don't even have working toilets, don't meet minimum safety requirements. We have public schools in America that don't have libraries. We have millions of American children going to schools that do not have the adequate school supplies to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot read by the age of 8, then the chances of high school graduation are drastically diminished, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have millions of American children living in what's called America's domestic war zones, where the violence that they experience on a daily basis at home, at school, in their streets, in their communities is so great that psychologists say that the PTSD experienced by a returning veteran from Iraq or Afghanistan is no worse than the PTSD experienced by these children. We need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of children, particularly 10 years old and younger. Every single school in this country should be a palace of learning, a palace of the culture and the arts. We are the only advanced country that bases so much of our educational funding on property taxes. Now, if one person neglects a needy child, we call that person unethical at best and criminal at worst. This is collective child neglect, and that's why I want a United States cabinet level Department of Children and Youth. We have elementary school children in this country on suicide watch. We have 41 million Americans who are food insecure, and that includes among them millions of hungry children. So we need wraparound services, anti-bullying, restorative justice, conflict resolution, mindfulness in the schools. You know, when Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand said that one of her goals is that New Zealand would be the best place in the world for a child to grow up. If I'm president, she's going to be one of my first calls, and I'm going to say, girlfriend, you're on.
Let's talk about reparations.
Okay.
So this is something you've been advocating for many, many years.
Back since that book in 1997.
Yeah, I mean, now it's kind of the hot topic, and you know, every candidate's being asked about this, but you've been talking about this for over 20 years now.
Well, yeah, because even in the early 90s with my book Illuminata, I had ritualized prayers of apology to descendants of slaves, also to Native Americans. You know, my field has been personal transformation, and all that a country is a group of individuals. So the same psychological and emotional and spiritual principles that prevail within the journey of an individual prevail within the life of a nation. Even Abraham Lincoln said a nation must confess its sins. So in AA they talk about taking a fearless moral inventory, admitting the exact nature of your character defects. This country has to do that. This country has to recognize that racism was our original character defect. Now, I do not believe that the average American is a racist. I don't. But I do think the average American is woefully undereducated about the history of race in the United States. So what I do in my campaign talks is I ask people for the permission to become your American history teacher for a couple minutes. And I talk about how slavery began in 1619, wasn't over till 1865, that's almost 2.5 centuries. At the end of the Civil War, there were between 4 and 5 million slaves. The U.S. government promised every former slave family of 4, 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule would have given a former slave, now freed, an opportunity to make a living, an opportunity to build a life within this new condition. Most of the cases it wasn't given, even where it was given, most of the cases it was taken away. And the Southern legislatures then passed what were called the Black Code laws to ensure subpar economic and social and political opportunities for black people. So just think about this. 2.5 centuries of slavery, followed by 100 years of what today we would see as domestic terrorism. Lynchings, that was domestic terror. Ku Klux Klan, that was domestic terror.
Yeah.
Full-on institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, that's domestic terror. None of that was fundamentally challenged and altered till the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. 1964, Civil Rights Act dismantled segregation. 1965, the Voting Rights Act gave full voting rights to blacks, although 2013, John Roberts Court starts chipping away at that, which is why we have all these voter suppression efforts. The point here is that the issue of economic restitution, which was addressed at the beginning, and which I think might have been different if Lincoln had lived, was simply, we simply haven't gotten to that. And and also, I don't think we should fail to acknowledge that in many situations where black wealth has begun to be accumulated, policies from local communities have been promulgated and established that actually thwarted those efforts to build black wealth. Plus we're sliding backwards now with mass incarceration and racial disparity in sentencing, etc. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since World War II. This has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. And in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, where all surviving prisoners from the Japanese internment camps during World War II were given between $20,000 and $22,000. So I don't think that we should see reparations as anything other than a reasonable thing that you do. And the reason I see it as very different than what some candidates are talking about when they refer to race-based policies is that race-based policies leaves open the question of whose fault this is. And reparations carries within it moral force. It is an inherent mea culpa. It is an inherent, this is a debt that is owed. And so it carries a psychological and an emotional and a spiritual force that is very much needed in the effort at reconciliation between the races in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about reparations because I haven't been able to fully get on board with it, mainly because there seems to be so much disagreement within the black community on who would get it and how. And that to me is always where I get it, because I agree that if your family was promised 40 acres and a mule, then you should get that. That's, I mean, it's owed. If the government stole it from you, or if it was promised to you and never given to you, then you absolutely are owed this. Same thing with Native Americans. If land was stolen from you, we have to pay these debts back. I think for me it comes down to who gets that debt paid back. And for many in the movement, I found that they say, well, if your skin is now white today, you wouldn't get it. Even if your family, even if you are a direct descendant of this person who was promised these 40 acres and a mule, me being a mixed race person, that doesn't sit well with me, because I feel like I have two fully white siblings and I'm the only one who's half Asian, and I think, gosh, I mean, could you imagine if the will was written from my father saying, only my white kids are gonna get this, but not my one kid who happens to have different colored skin. I have a problem with that. So for me, I've had this issue with reparations in that, if you are a descendant of these slaves, I don't care what the color of your skin is today, you should get it because that's your ancestor, it's your parent, it's your great parent who was owed this, and you're an ancestor of them, you should be owed that portion. So I think that's where for me I'm
Do you want to hear what my plan would be?
Yeah.
My plan would be that there would be a reparations council. And there are people who have done great scholarly work on this. Ta-Nehisi Coates has done work on it, Sandy Darity and others. The amount would be determined, and the money would be dispersed over 20 years. And the money, the stipulation is that it is specifically for projects of economic and educational renewal among American descendants of slaves. Now, all those questions that you just posed would be theirs to deal with. If I owe you money, I don't really get to tell you how to spend it. Now, it's going to be a lot of money, so it's not like the United States would have no right, the United States government would have no right to have some within these parameters and to see that, yes, these are systems of educational and economic renewal. But within that, questions such as you're posing, I think would be left to that council. It would be theirs to determine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and then they would be the ones taking the heat for it.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. As it should be, actually. You know,
yeah.
that's
yeah. I mean, like I said, I'm all for it. The principle of it.
No, and I hear what you're saying. It's gnarly. It's gnarly, and also I've been in this conversation long enough to know no matter what number you arrive at, there are going to be people who think it's too much.
Right.
And no matter what number you arrive at, there are going to be people who think it's not enough.
Yeah.
So.
Medicare for all.
Yes.
You for it, or
absolutely yes.
Okay. Now I know that you've at points have talked about things like maybe an option, a public option into it.
Well, some people say that if you don't make it all Medicare for all without any private insurance, that gums up the system.
Yeah.
But I've heard other people say that doesn't necessarily have to be true. So my preference would be that you could continue with the Obamacare exchanges, add the option of Medicare for all. People would gravitate to that. And then if people want private health insurance, they could also have that. Some people say that's not possible. I'm listening to the people, though, who say that it is possible. I certainly like that as an array of choice if it is.
Why do you want to keep that?
Because I like the idea. I like the idea of everyone being able to relax because you've got coverage. Period. End of story.
Yeah.
That's my number one priority. Within that, however, to whatever extent people can have choices in their lives, I'm all for it.
So you like the idea basically because you want to give people the choice still, but you want everybody covered.
Yes. I want the chronic anxiety about what will happen if I get sick and what will happen if my child gets sick. I want that removed from the equation. I want the money that people have to spend of their income on health care, I want that to end. We need to do that. Then if that can be handled and people have choices, cool. So
who would you listen to when it comes to that debate, right? Because so you're sitting in the Oval Office and you're President of the United States and you've got all these different people coming to you, people on one camp saying, no, it has to be all Medicare for all, other people saying, no, there's incremental ways to get into it. Who would you trust?
I don't see where that's any different for the president than for anyone else. The people that, number one, you think are the smartest, who are making the most sense, who you trust because they haven't been shining you on before. You get that there's nothing in it for them. I think that you come to the presidency, as you come to anything, with the accrued wisdom of what you've learned before you got there. So I think that my many years of experience, both failure and success, have led me to a pretty good radar. You have to be smart enough to be in the room, but after that there's some issues about how you operate that I'm looking for.
A couple of other things that I want to get to, gun control. So we clearly have a problem with mass shootings, and we just recently had the synagogue shooting in Poway, and luckily the guy's gun was jammed, so he wasn't able to do any, much more damage. But what do you think we need to do?
Well, I agree with the American people. This is another example of where the will of the people is being overridden by the will of the gun manufacturers. The American people want universal background checks. The American people want to outlaw bump stocks. The American people want to keep military assault rifles out of the hands of the average citizen. So once again, it goes back to that's just a symptom. We need to deal with the deeper cause. I attended the funeral of Lori Kay yesterday. The rabbi gave the most beautiful talk about how something good, he said, will come of this. I am a Jew, and when the shootings at the synagogue in Pittsburgh happened, we could say, terrible, crazy man. But now between the shootings in Pittsburgh, the shootings at in Christchurch in New Zealand, and what happened in Poway. It's like I saw in a tweet somewhere, somebody said something, how many lone wolves do there have to be before we realize there's a pack? And so the deeper issue of white supremacy as an increasingly organized terrorist force in this country is something I take very, very seriously. These are very, very serious times. These are not all operable tumors. Many of these problems are more like cancers that have metastasized. And so when you ask me, are there enough people out there who realize what the deeper level of problem is, whether it has to do with money or anything else. What I do believe very strongly is that when you talk to Americans like they're intelligent adults, they rise to the occasion. And part of the corruption of our political system is that the system doesn't even, it infantilizes people, doesn't even talk to them like serious adults. I want to talk to people like they're serious adults. I feel responded to. I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't still be here if I did not feel there was a listening for that. I am not a politician who's telling you everything's rosy. I'm telling you we have to look at some very, very serious issues. And when we do, and when we atone, and when we make amends, and when we make the necessary fundamental changes, this country will be better than ever, and we will see a beautiful, beautiful unfolding in the 21st century.
You want a peace department. What does that look like to you?
Well, there was originally a proposed legislation that was given at first by Dennis Kucinich for a U.S. Department of Peace, and it called for a 2% of whatever your military budget is every year that would be used to coordinate the best practices. We have restorative justice, conflict resolution, anti-trauma, anti-bullying, wraparound services for children, mindfulness in the schools. There are so many peace-building ways, humanitarian efforts, mediation, development. There are so many factors, as I said before, that actually build peace. You can't just take medicine. You have to cultivate your health, and you can't just try to suppress conflict through more bombs or more prisons. We have to address these things on the causal level, having to do with those base levels experiences of trauma that cause conflict to ultimately emerge.
2% seems really low. I think we need more than 2% of the military budget.
That was what
more like 25% or
called for.
200%. How about 200%? We need to double what we're spending on war, on peace. With the military-industrial complex, there's so much money in it, and there's just so many people at play that I think it would be difficult sitting in that chair knowing who to trust. And I kind of go back to that, like, how do you know who to trust? Because once you're sitting there, how do you know that the person next to you, I mean, could you trust the CIA? Can you trust the generals? Can you trust the advisors who all potentially have some skin in the game, or they've got friends with skin in the game, or so it's complicated.
The man who is the acting chief of the Defense Department right now is the 30-year executive at Boeing. So right. I can tell you that's not who I would be looking to draw up plans. The most important people that I would be looking to are those who are the great humanitarians and diplomats who know how to wage peace. That's what I'm interested in. You can't just take medicine, you have to cultivate health. And you can't just have a preparedness for war. I mean, I have great respect for the military, and I think we all should. I don't see this as the military's fault. These are political decisions. Mm-hmm. My father fought in World War II. I think of the military like a surgeon. If you're going to have surgery, you want the best surgeon, but you try to avoid surgery. Right now, there's a vested economic interest for some in having what would be the analogy to surgery. Even Donald Rumsfeld said we have to wage peace. General Mattis said, if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition. So right now, the factors that actually wage peace, diplomacy, development, mediation, expanding economic opportunities for women, expanding educational opportunities for children, reducing violence against women, ameliorating unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. Those are the ways you wage peace. But those don't necessarily make huge corporate profits for anyone. Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, not to even mention, we haven't even gotten into the nuclear industry. So right now, we have this much that we spend on actual peace creation, and that much that we spend, $718 billion this year alone on the military.
I think it's like $1 trillion, actually. They hide some money.
Probably, I agree with that. Now, this goes back, though, to the American people and how I perceive the American people. There is one particular tale I tell that has to do with the B-21 Raider. And I say to every campaign stop, I say to people, do you know about the B-21 Raiders? Most people say no. The United States Air Force has ordered 100 airplanes called the B-21 Raiders. The B-21 Raider, each one costs $550 million. And the interesting thing about these planes is that each one carries not only conventional, but also nuclear weapons. So I say to the audience, I say now, just think about this for a moment. Because if you drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it. Because every nuclear bomb that exists today makes Nagasaki and Hiroshima look like a pinprick. You drop 10 of those, and it's over for the human race for at least 200, 300,000 years. So who could possibly think that ordering 100 of those $550 million each planes had anything to do with an agenda for national security? Now, people are not stupid. People hear that and they know. The problem is a political system that hasn't been telling that story. And I felt that, I see that in this campaign. The things I'm talking about, such as that, I'm not saying anything every Democrat doesn't know, but if you don't name these things, you have no intention to solve them.
Right.
And our military is a perfect example of that. Our economic system has nothing to do with planning long-term economic good. It leaches from the economy in the present. If you wanted to really be preparing for a healthy economy 10 years from now, you'd be taking better care of your 10-year-olds today. And our national security agenda, nobody even talks about, we're going to create a world in which your children and your grandchildren could possibly live on a planet without war. They don't even try. They don't even have the conversation. The whole conversation is, well, what kind of wars are we going to be planning for then? And what kind of wars are we going to be planning for then? And not only that, but even the best military prognosticators say, even if you were coming from that direction, you wouldn't be planning the kind of wars these guys are planning, because they're just planning wars that have to do with the old model and their own profit maximization.
Well, I like that your number one is getting money out of politics. I think that is number one, and to me that is really what makes a progressive more than anything is this desire.
It's the underlying river of toxicity and poison.
Yeah. I mean, otherwise you're right, how can we get anything done? So we can talk about Medicare for all, we could talk about education, we could talk about all of these things, but it's a moot point. It's
just symptomatic. You're just eradicating a symptom or suppressing a symptom, but the symptom will just morph into another iteration.
I think that's why people with Medicare for All say you have to just go all out, because the people that still are kind of bought with the money are wanting the incrementalism because they know that it can be dismantled. That's what we're seeing right now with the ACA.
So you're saying that that it could then be dismantled, and that's the argument.
Right, just like it, well, we're seeing it now.
I haven't seen that one, yeah.
Well, so what we've got right now with the Republicans dismantling it, right, is that they've been able to chip away piece by piece. So we started off with the ACA, and then what they were able to do was kind of eliminate one of the protections. So they say, okay, well, you can offer short-term insurance without having to accept pre-existing conditions, or they started allowing these little allowances. And then it got to a point now where a judge basically said, well, it's totally, I mean, basically they got rid of it by saying that it was no longer held up, and that people didn't have to pay the penalty if they didn't pay into the insurance, which basically made it null and void. And now it's going to go to the courts, and without that, I don't know if it will actually survive. It's just a way for the big money people to say, okay, we'll give you this win for now, but we're eventually going to be able to chip away at this. This isn't like a total win. It's a half win, but it's a win we can maybe win back. And I think that's where it's kind of where people say you have to go all out or nothing.
I'm very open to learning more.
And that's the thing about Marianne. In my conversations with her on and off air, she really is genuinely open to learning more. She's open to hearing people out, and she leaves room for nuance. But most importantly, she fundamentally knows what is really broken in our political system. It isn't Donald Trump. It's everything that led up to Donald Trump and the money that has invaded our government.
I think politically, much like individually and personally, there's always a temptation to blame them. But I think if we all seek to show up at a higher level ourselves, we can do this. Generations before us did it. We answered slavery with abolition. We answered suppression of women with 2 major waves of feminism and the suffragette movement. We answered white supremacy institutionalized in segregation with civil rights movement. And the way I look at it, it's simply our time. It's our time to rise to the occasion. And it's a very grown-up assignment. It's going to take a lot of personal maturity and emotional and psychological as well as intellectual discipline. If we do it, we will do more than defeat Donald Trump. We need to do more than just not go over the cliff. We need to get out of the vicinity of the cliff. We need to slam it like nobody's business, and I think we can.